Welcome to Card Knock Life Plays. We're going to be doing a little modern Eldrazi and Taxes today. I think the deck is really well positioned in the meta. Obviously has a pretty good Grixis Death Shadow matchup. So we're going to run it through a league and see what comes out. I did write a primer on this one. It was at times criticized for being not as in-depth as some people would have liked. I guess I more intended on it being a get you excited about the deck. Hopefully you want to play it. But didn't really go into all the intricacies of, you know, the things that you can do with the stack and with all the blinking of Flickerwisp at end of turn and all the tricks of Flickerwisp and Eldrazi Displacer and Wasteland Strangler and things like that. So hopefully I can showcase some of that in this league. This is a really, really fun deck to play. It's a challenging deck to play in that it looks like a heap of bad cards. When you look at it, they're just like a lot of bears. I mean, this is the evolution of what used to be called hate bears, which was literally just a deck that played two power creatures that basically did things that made it hard for your opponent to play the game of Magic. So now we've got Eldrazi Temple paired with Thought-Knot Seer, Wasteland Strangler, Eldrazi Displacer, and it allows us to be a little bit more aggressive, but also these guys still advance the plan of really hating out your opponent's strategy. Eldrazi Displacer is the biggest and most important piece of this deck in that it can do just about everything. There are lots of comes into play abilities that you want to be spamming with it, like Flickerwisp, Wasteland Strangler, and at times Thought-Knot Seer. You can be blinking and getting some other cards out of their hands with Eldrazi Displacer. And then some tricks, like I mentioned before with Flickerwisp and Eldrazi Displacer, if you do this at end of turn, you can blink a permanent through the next end step, because the trigger is at the beginning of the end step, and if you do it at an end step, it will come back at the beginning of the next end step. So that's kind of a nice little trick. You can remove a land, you can remove a planeswalker on the opponent's turn, and it's super utility. Now the greatest part of this is we run 4 Aether Vial here, which is a great way to get past counter magic. It's a great way to surprise your opponent with some blockers. It's a great way to flash in some discard spells on their turn after their draw step. But it also is a great way to free up a lot of the mana that you're going to need to use to put into the Eldrazi Displacer activation cost. Because 3 mana is a lot to ask for with this guy. You're going to need to want to use as much of that as possible. And really, once you hit 6 mana, being able to activate that twice is all the more fun, obviously, but really is when you're actually going off with the deck. Now, there are things that you can do with Wasteland Strangler and Flickerwisp as well that are really cool. Flickerwisp can exile the permanent until end of turn. Strangler can put that permanent into the graveyard for good as part of its processing cost. So that's fun. The same can happen with Thought-Knot Seer. Obviously, they're still going to get to draw a card when Thought-Knot Seer dies, but that's one other way to exile a card. Path to Exile does it as well. So there are lots of ways to power up this Wasteland Strangler processing. Strangler is really a great card in this deck, knowing that it can just eat like a Birds of Paradise or a Noble Hierarch or anything really for that matter that's small enough to be shrunk down by -3/-3. Thalia is really kind of the most the best known piece of the Death and Taxes shell. Comes from the Legacy version as well, whereas you've got a really, really efficient 2-drop creature that taxes your opponent's removal spells, taxes your opponent's ponder type effects, and anything that a combo deck might want to be doing that doesn't involve, you know, like dropping creatures. So we run a full 4 Thalia. Some decks go down to 3. The only thing it really affects for us is our Path to Exile and our Aether Vial, which isn't a huge cost, because if we're playing an Aether Vial, then it frees up our mana to be, you know, using the mana on non-creature spells anyway. Hopefully, ideally, we're going to be playing our Aether Vial on turn 1 in every case, and I know it's not always how it goes, but it's definitely got diminishing returns, whereas, you know, it needs a counter every turn. It takes a while for it to accumulate counters to get to the point where you're really playing creatures that matter with it. But it's always a good card. Don't get me wrong. It's always a good card. Shambling Vent is another thing that Aether Vial frees up our mana for, and I know I'm kind of going sort of randomly through here. When we are not needing to tap out for our creatures, we can be animating our Shambling Vent and attacking in. Some people are going down to 2 Shambling Vents instead of 3 and then running like 1 Godless Shrine in the deck. The reason for that is it's a little funky with Shambling Vent and Tidehollow Sculler because you need 2 colored costs in Tidehollow Sculler, and we play a lot of colorless lands. So in a lot of games, you have this kind of awkward turn 1, turn 2 decision making where you maybe have like an Aether Vial that you want to play on turn 1, but that's not going to allow you to play Tidehollow Sculler on turn 2. It's not a huge deal, but you kind of want to have access to something that's going to come into play untapped and also provide the black or white, which is why Concealed Courtyard is so great for our deck. Obviously a new addition from the Kaladesh block. Let's see. Dark Confidant is kind of a new inclusion in this deck as of, like maybe last year. It's been played for about a year. This card obviously isn't going to be paying us too much because the biggest cost in our deck is a Thought-Knot Seer. But a lot of the problem that we run into with Death and Taxes is that we are just drawing nothing. We're just running out of cards to play off the top of our deck. And so Dark Confidant really gives you some more gas to power through with that. Additionally, it's a 2-drop, so it's easy to cast off Aether Vial. Aether Vial, we're probably going to hang out and play a couple of our 2-drops in our hand on it, and then maybe stick to 3 for a while. Typically, I don't want to go up to 4 because the only spell I can play on 4 is Thought-Knot Seer, and usually I can do that off the back of like 2 Eldrazi Temples or an Eldrazi Temple and 2 lands or something like that anyway. But we get more value out of instant speed, Flickerwisp, instant speed, Mirran Crusader, instant speed, Wasteland Strangler, that kind of thing. Now, this is kind of the flex spot in the deck. I run 1 Mirran Crusader because of Death Shadow being such a big deal right now. Mirran Crusader is really good against, any deck that runs black and green, for that matter. Obviously, really good against Jund. But I think it's worth playing a 1-of in the deck because it's just generally a decent card. 2/2 double strike for 3 is fine. Even if your opponent doesn't have any black or green in the deck, 2/2 double strike is fine. Like I said, a good surprise blocker. Anything with first strike or double strike is a good surprise blocker. Not to mention a good card to throw down and then attack in for 4 in the next turn. Hopefully that's enough to beat him down. This deck really packs a lot more punch than the previous Hate Bearers decks because we have cards like Mirran Crusader and Thought-Knot Seer that can be doing, like 4 damage worth of attacks versus the older versions were playing things like the, what was the hybrid costed owl that basically was like a curse catcher, things like that. So we're a little less focused on the taxing effects and a little more focused on the, the aggression and sort of undercosted Eldrazi spells. So some of the best plans come off of the back of like Eldrazi Temple, Thought-Knot Seer on turn 2. It's like, okay, it's hard to deal with that, right? But then you don't always just luck into that, and you have to kind of generate some sort of engine via like Eldrazi Temple, Caves of Koilos, and just start to spam Eldrazi Displacer effects. The Temple really nets you quite a bit of an advantage in that, just having that extra land or extra mana at your disposal to play a card that really is mana hungry is pretty necessary. Last thing I didn't talk about, and this is the oldest piece of the puzzle here as far as this modern version of the deck goes, is Leonin Arbiter. Players can't search libraries unless they pay 2 to ignore the effect until end of turn. This pairs with Ghost Quarter, and it pairs with Path to Exile, so that we can basically be strip mining the opponent's lands and basically just straight up removing their creatures so that they cannot search their library for a land. This is great when we're already taxing them with cards like Thalia. So there are situations that can be really backbreaking where your opponent's like kind of hurting for land already, and we drop a Ghost Quarter Leonin Arbiter that can really just take over the game. Particularly against Death Shadow, where they're playing kind of a greedy mana base with only like 19 lands. They're like 3 colors, 19 lands. If we get a Leonin Arbiter and we can strip like their Watery Grave early on, that can be pretty dominant. Assuming that we don't get it Thought Seized out of our hand already at that point. Alright, let's look at the sideboard. My sideboard's a little different than your typical Eldrazi and Taxes decks. There are a couple of cards that are pretty much staples in the black-white version. Orzhov Pontiff obviously is a really good card to include. A really good creature to spam with Eldrazi Displacer. kind of a catch-all and super utility. Now the Haunt is an ability that you're not going to see used too often with this guy, but in dire circumstances it can attach to a creature when it dies, and when the creature it's haunting dies, it can do its effect one more time. Burrenton Forge-Tender is kind of a necessary evil against like Anger of the Gods and anything, anything burny, as is Kor Firewalker. When we're dealing with an aggressive red deck, we're going to want to be on some Kor Firewalkers. Basically can shut those decks down. It's very tough for those decks to beat. One of the advantages of running white is that we get to run cards like Stony Silence and Rest in Peace. One of the disadvantages of running Stony Silence is we play Aether Vial, so we need to cut our Aether Vials. Some decks go up to as many as 4 of these. I haven't seen a ton of affinity, but I know it's out there. There really is a lot of affinity, so it's certainly not wrong to run 4 Stony Silence. I've opted for more like Zealous Persecution and even like an Anguished Unmaking, so I have more like options with my cards that can be used against affinity. I know it's not great. This obviously is like less than ideal, less than stellar against affinity, but at times it's kind of what you need. I've run a Pithing Needle in my deck for just a variety of reasons. Recently I played Merfolk, and I think that that's a good stop to their Mutavaults. It's a good way to deal with man lands that typically would be tough to deal with unless we are going to Ghost Quarter them. And also can stop the opposing Aether Vials, as well as my own. I'd have to be careful of that. It can stop Planeswalkers. I mean, you know what Pithing Needle does. It's a good utility sideboard card. Got another Mirran Crusader for all the reasons I mentioned previously. Some decks are running 2-3 Fatal Push in the sideboard. Obviously, more cheap removal is good for us. We want to deal with aggressive creature decks, and we want to deal with them quickly. So 1 mana removal is awesome. Zealous Persecution is kind of like the 3rd copy of Orzhov Pontiff. This card is super surprising. If you're not familiar with what it does, I know it's kind of off screen there. Until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1, and creatures you don't control get -1/-1. It is almost always a total blowout when it gets played. It makes combat math miserable and basically makes all of the blockers that they thought were going to trade or thought were going to survive die. And I love it. And there's no reason that you shouldn't be running one of at all times, because when you just randomly draw it on a board full of creatures, it can break up the stalemate like no other. I think I covered everything in the sideboard. I Rest in Peace I didn't really talk about too much, but I mean, obviously we want some graveyard removal against things like Dredge. Another one that we can run more of if we need to. Anguished Unmaking is kind of a weird one to run in the sideboard. I don't know. I guess the reason for that one is just because I want sort of a more catch-all. I'm more about like utility than more specifically focused sideboard cards, and maybe that's wrong. Maybe I need to kind of just be more focused on what matchups are bad and include answers to those matchups. But I think my style of play is more like I want more cards that can do more things, and I want access to more of those than to just hone in on things like 4 Stony Silence for affinity and artifact strategies. So there you have it. We're going to try a few games with this Eldrazi and Taxes deck. I really do love this deck. It's super fun to play. I might make some mistakes as I'm trying to commentate as I play, so please don't hold it against me. But feel free to share in comments if you see some things that could have been done differently. All right. Thank you for watching.